It is now 12 o'clock in Toronto. Good afternoon to all of you joining us from across the country or wherever you are. Welcome to all of our Logic subscribers and to new readers. A brief explanation for those of you who are joining us for the very first time for this talk today. The Logic is an independent news publication that covers Canadian business and tech. We cover everything from EVs, like you will hear today, to crypto, open banking, to digital policy and taxation. In addition to our reporting and daily newsletter, subscribers also get access to exclusive monthly insider events like this one, company sentiment analysis, community surveys, Slack channels, and postings. My name is David Skok. I am the CEO and editor in chief of The Logic. And today, we're really excited to have a conversation. You know, the Shift newsletter started last June. It's been a couple of months, and we've gotten our feet underneath us. And it's really a great time for us to step back and take stock of everything that's been happening in this space. As this event is titled From Ice Age to EV Era, we're going to take a look at everything from the customer experience right at the front and the supply and demand happening at that level, all the way up to manufacturing in the sector and how these rapid changes have occurred. I encourage everyone, if you have a question, we want your questions. This is for you. I talk to Anita every day. I get her brilliance, but this is your chance to seek out her brilliance. You can do so in the chat or under the questions section at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and we will try to get to as many as possible throughout the discussion. I also would like to send a huge thank you to our partner, Google Think Auto, for making this event possible and for your continued support in making Shift your guide to automotive tech free for all subscribers. Google Think Auto is a terrific part of Google that focuses on providing insights and statistics for consumers and for partners and suppliers to get better insights into making decisions, particularly as we look at the shift in automotive consumption from the ice age to the EV era. So, with that, I would love to introduce Claudia Siama, who's joining us from Google to provide some opening remarks. Claudia is the managing director of auto and consumer goods at Google Canada, where she helps major automotive brands adapt to new digital marketing realities. And prior to joining the Google Canada team, she's based in Toronto in September of 2018. Claudia was the retail director at Google Brazil, leading the partnerships with major retailers. Welcome, Claudia.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. And hello, everyone. We are really thrilled to be here as today's sponsor, and we're looking forward to the next hour of discussion. So why are we here today? Well, if I think it's safe to say that after the enormous disruption of the past few years, we now find ourselves in a period of uncertainty. And amid that uncertainty, we are all seeking answers. So, to help to provide some insight into the automobile space, Google has recently conducted new research to explore how Canadians shopped for their most recent vehicles. And to complement that research, we have also captured a variety of signals of consumer trends across Google products like search, YouTube, maps, and so on. So the result of this is a clear view of how today's and tomorrow car buying behavior has shifted dramatically. From the way car buyers seek information, make decisions, and choose brands to how and where they want to make purchases. Some of the most compelling and relevant insights we have found are centered on the shift to electric vehicles. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. So here are a few of what really caught our attention in this research. Along with the US, Australia, and Spain, Canada has now officially passed 5% market share tipping point, after which EVs skyrocket from being niche to mainstream. This is no longer an emerging trend anymore, but is an established customer need with really high pent-up demand. So, who are these early adopters? We know that EV purchasers are 25% more likely to be millennials. And remember, millennials are not kids anymore. The average age is 41. And all of them, and most of them, are already purchasing their second car. And we also know that early adopters are affluent and 60% more likely to be premium car buyers than today's ICE buyers. And And how do they plan to purchase a car? Not surprisingly, their search is more in-depth than traditional ICE cars. They consider more models, 3.3 versus 2.4, and they will even consider brands that don't exist. Fun fact, recent Bloomberg research shows that 26% of consumers would consider purchasing an EV from Apple, even though they have never built or sold a car. So these customers love to research, and their path to purchase is longer and more digital than an average car buyer's journey. Their online sources over-index search, online video, and brand websites. Perhaps owing to this behavior, we also see higher than average conversion rates. One in every two Canadians who consider an EV will buy it. This is higher than the global average and even the US ones. Okay, and where do they want to purchase their car? EV buyers are more open to buying their cars online with zero dealership contact. And our research shows that 2/3 of the EV shoppers plan to make their next purchase 100% online. Well, so what does all of this mean to us? Canadians' appetite for electric vehicles is significantly increasing, and they are demanding a new customer experience, different from the traditional ones offered by OEMs and dealers. And Canada has the potential to be the tip of the spear with this rapidly emerging space. But the question is, are the OEMs prepared to meet this shift? And more broadly, is Canada ready to provide the infrastructure and support required to remove consumer barriers to entry such an infrastructure support? Now, I will hand it over to David and Anita to share their point of view on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Claudia. And that's a wonderful tee up for what we're going to talk about today. Particularly, I'll start off and bring in Anita if I can. Anita Balakrishnan, our intrepid automotive tech reporter. Welcome, Anita. We like to start these things with news, and it will be extrapolate or explain more in tomorrow's Shift newsletter, I'm sure. But there is news on some of this already just today. The Canada Infrastructure Bank announcing this morning that they are putting 500 million, well, let me get this right here, to add 50,000 new chargers to the 22,000 Canada now has. I'm just curious, and we'll get into the demand piece, but from a charging perspective, this new news from CIB, how significant is that?
I think it's a step in the right direction, certainly. We have a big gap, I think, worldwide, but in Canada as well, to leap from the early adopters of EVs to more general car buyer purchases. And I think charging is a big issue with that, particularly if you live in a rural area, if you live in an apartment building, if you can only afford one car with which interest rates the way they are, that may be a lot of people right now. Historically, a lot of people who have purchased EVs are people who can charge in a garage that they own their home. They're people who maybe already have a gas-powered vehicle that they can drive long distances, and then they can, save on gas money on their everyday commute with their EV. So getting beyond that initial group to a wider audience, I think, is going to be the big challenge that automakers have in front of them. And so the more public charging infrastructure there is, that's going to help, push things forward for those people that don't have their own charging at home. But there is this chicken and the egg problem of, if we want individual businesses to invest in EV chargers for their lots, they're going to want to have, know that people are going to be able to use them. But people who are buying cars want to know that there are chargers out there for them to use. So I think that's sort of the place where government comes in and says, okay, we got to get the ball moving to show people that there is charging infrastructure available. And then once we have more EV drivers on the road, then individual businesses can feel safer in investing in that infrastructure as well. So I definitely think that it's an important step to spur adoption.
Okay, indulging my own personal selfish interest here for a second. So we had a catalytic converter stolen under our car earlier this week, and so the cost of replacing our car turns out to be more to replacing the catalytic converter turns out more than getting a new car. So we are now looking for a new car. As a decision point tree, as a consumer, looking at some of these insights that Google has provided, like 74% or 58% of new car buyers don't consider EVs because of battery charging and range anxiety, and 35% believe there are too few charging stations. News like the CIB announcement, it's not just about CIB, right? It's about all of these manufacturers getting and consumers getting over this range anxiety. So if you're me, where do you go now to buy a car? How has that changed over the last 10 years? It used to be I'd go to a car dealer, I'd talk to somebody, let me sit in the car for a few minutes, get a good feel for it. How has that process changed over the last 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, so you obviously have a background in the dealership industry, family history, so you know some of this stuff very well, but we really haven't seen a sort of normal car buying experience over the past couple of years, which makes it really noisy to tell exactly like what the interest is in EVs. On the one hand, even pre-pandemic, EVs were the supply was funneled very much towards the two provinces, Quebec and BC, that had the highest adoption, that had incentives and mandates already in place. And so, you know, traditionally you go to the lot and you buy what's on the lot, and the dealers sell what's on the lot. And over the past couple of years, there has been, you know, a huge supply chain crunch. And so a lot of the vehicles that you want are not on the lot. And so you're ordering them direct. And I think that's causing kind of a shift alongside what Claudia was talking about with car buyers doing more research online toward online purchases or online orders. Obviously, that I guess eliminates some of the haggling kind of dynamic that maybe many of us are used to. So I think that's a big shift, and that depends on your personal preference, I guess, what you prefer. But also with interest rates rising, we don't have our usual demand side or our usual supply side. So it's going to be very interesting once some of that supply comes online. What happens to prices at that point? Do auto dealers kind of flood the market and bring those prices back down quickly? Or do they try to do it gradually to hang on to those higher prices? That's going to be something I think that we watch over the next year and see what happens.
You wrote a piece, I believe it was last year, that was really fascinating to me. As you mentioned, my father was in car dealership world, so it is a fascinating area for me personally. But you did mention that a lot of these dealerships now are changing too. They're not only, it's not John Smith in a parking lot telling you that he's got a 0% financing deal. It's now they're hiring SEO experts. Wonder if you could shed a little light on that.
Yeah, so I think, you know, we as consumers are obviously thinking about how this is going to change, you know, what's going on in our parking spot or our garage. But dealers are also having to make a big shift, even things like General Motors changing its logo to be more EV focused. You know, that means every dealer has to invest in getting a new sign. More EVs means more dealers have to invest in chargers. And so all those costs add up for the dealership, and they're you know, having to think about how they're going to handle that transition. At the same time, we're seeing a lot of startups selling vehicles online, and also automakers themselves saying that they want to sell more directly to consumers and skip that dealership step. And the dealerships becoming more like showrooms or sort of billboards for the product where people can go see it in person, and then ultimately order online. And obviously Tesla has led the way in that charge, but we may see that trend accelerate a lot more as sort of all of the cost structure of being a dealer changes very quickly.
What other OEMs? I mean, you mentioned Tesla, but are there others that have stood out for you as changing this purchasing relationship?
That's a good question. I think we've seen General Motors has said for their like Buick dealers, for example, we want you to invest this much in the new EV version of Buicks, and if you don't want to, we'll buy you out. And I think Ford has also sort of rolled out their plan for dealers and what they're going to have to invest. Yeah, I think we're starting to see some of those more traditional automakers bringing forward plans, and I think also Stellantis and Volkswagen have also talked about, becoming more software first, and I think part of that is e-commerce.
So that's a big question, and one of the interesting things I wrote down here from Claudia's opening remarks were that 26% would consider purchasing an EV from Apple. We know here in Canada, obviously, BlackBerry is a company that we follow closely that's heavily involved in the automotive space. Are these car companies now, or are they tech companies?
I think that's going to be an interesting issue to watch going forward for a couple of reasons. I think, first of all, um, it kind of puts to the test a lot of the brand loyalty that auto companies have or have not built up over the years. On the one hand, when it comes to a safety perspective, you may be feeling more drawn towards something that's tried and true versus a startup that doesn't have a lot of experience in the auto building space. Because if you're shipping software, if you're shipping iOS, like if there's a mistake in it, you just ship another version. If you have a 16-year-old driving a huge hunk of metal that it's a huge safety risk, that's not the same level of risk, right? So but then on the other hand, I think things like the emissions scandals, ignition switch recalls, those have not engendered a lot of trust in some communities in the traditional automakers. So there may be room for someone new to come in and say, we're going to do things differently.
All right, we have a bunch of great audience questions. So I'm going to start with one from Richard. Richard Pearl. GM has fired a shot across the bow of all audience manufacturers with the introduction of the mass market Chevy Equinox EV in 2024 for $30,000. Do you feel this represents a tipping point for other auto manufacturers to introduce their own mass market EVs?
Yes. I think especially with car prices as high as they have been in the past few years and EV prices specifically, we know that in Canada, SUVs and trucks are the best selling vehicles, and they have been the best selling vehicles. The F-Series, Ford F-Series has been the best selling vehicle in Canada for 40 years or something like that. So that market is a huge market that hasn't really been tapped by EV makers up until now. So that's going to be a big draw. And then obviously, sedans like the Bolt coming down in price. A lot of that is thanks to batteries coming down in price. As more EVs come out and batteries become, more difficult to source, I think that we may see those price dynamics shift. But it's certainly a strong way to come out the door.
Okay, we're going to get to that point. So we're working our way up from the consumer purchasing decision, and then we're going to work back up through the mining and ultimately the supply of the mining supply. Question here from Deepak. What is the main driver for a car buyer shift from gas powered to EVs? Is it because EVs are cheaper in recurring cost per mile in maintenance, or because it's considered environmentally friendly, or is it something else?
That's a good question. And I think, Claudia probably has a lot of more stats on that. But I think at the end of the day, a lot of us aren't going to have choice anyway, because the government wants all new vehicle sales to be zero emission vehicles in the next 15 years. So if it's not this vehicle that you're buying today, maybe your next vehicle, is going to be some sort of either battery electric or hydrogen, some other sort of emission-free vehicle. I think gas prices are definitely pushing more interest in EVs. But I also think that there is a high percentage of people who are interested in EVs who also say that they are interested in the environment. Whether that's the final decision that pushes them to purchase it, I don't know. But I think there are some pros and cons within the environmental movement about how to look at EVs, and that's maybe its own huge topic. I think at the end of the day, your pocketbook is what makes a big difference to a lot of people.
Pocketbook, and then coming back to my own decision making process, it's how quickly can the EV get from the factory to my house. So let's talk about that a little bit. Obviously, supply chain. We just did a 6-part series on supply chains, but supply chains have been an ongoing thing. Uh, what is the current status of supply chain delays, and particularly about shipping delays and ordering? If I decide today we're going to buy an EV, what's the time that we can expect at this point? And how has it come down since the beginning of the summer?
That's a great question. I think Claudia shared some statistics with us, and maybe we can put those in the chat at some point. But I think the automakers seem optimistic that supply chain issues are going to come down. I think BMW said they're expecting to see a 70% jump in EV sales next year. So they seem to have some sort of plan to execute that right now. But there is a huge backlog of deliveries that they're going to have to do to be able to get to that point. So we also have seen Toyota say that they are cutting their output next month. So it's definitely not an across the board improvement in supply chain issues. But if you look at Statistics Canada import data, the imports of EVs are growing much faster than the imports of motor vehicles in general. So there is some suggestion that some deliveries are happening at least.
That's really interesting that the imports are happening more. Actually, one other thing before we move on, Claudia mentioned the 5% number, and everybody talks about the 5% as being a key threshold. Why is the 5% a key threshold? 5% adoption, I should say.
Yeah, I think that we've seen countries like Norway and some other European countries, and especially China, adopt EVs at a much quicker rate, and that seems to be a point that analysts have pointed to and said, after you get to this point, the infrastructure starts coming together. People start knowing somebody that has an EV and understanding how it works, and seeing chargers places, and seeing them on dealership lots, and it kind of snowballs from all of those effects. So I think there is some data from those countries that suggests that was kind of the point where things really started to curve up.
The key tipping point. And so for the first 2 quarters of 2022, we are over 5% purchasing in EVs. Is that correct? And so the trend line is not zero emission vehicles, but electric vehicles. So this will be the first year that we would hit that 5%.
So I think the vast majority of zero emission vehicles are battery electric vehicles sold today. I think there's really only one hydrogen model that's sold. So yeah, I think we are above 5% for at least the past year. So we are on that upward curve. Obviously still a small percentage of total sales. We're around 7% right now, although I think in Quebec and BC it's slightly higher. BC is the highest adopter of EVs in North America. So they are maybe someone we can look to and see that sort of really big increase over the past couple of years.
Okay. We have a question here from Stephen Hanratty. How many charging stations? So now we get back to the range anxiety portion of this conversation. How many charging stations does Canada need to put in place before EVs really take off? And how much money will that take? Do you have specifics on cost? Not to put you on the spot. I think the bigger question is, what is the number that's really needed, given even what Canada Infrastructure Bank announced today. Um, what is a reasonable number for EV consumers to not have to worry anymore about range anxiety?
Um, I think so. I think a lot of the modeling today, there was a report that NRCan put out, Natural Resources Canada put out maybe a few weeks ago, that kind of looks at this, and a lot of it depends on, I think, to what extent home charging is adopted, and that will kind of determine what how many public chargers we need, because that I think is kind of the big wild card right now. Um, is where are those public chargers going to come from? How many are there? Is it going to be like every office building, every mall has their own charger, and you can kind of charge wherever you go, similar to a gas station? Or is it going to be a lot of home charging? I think a lot of the countries that have adopted EV so far have focused almost entirely on home charging, but they also have a lot more chargers per person than we do publicly. So, I think that will become a question once we start getting to drivers that are in more like rural areas where they have to drive a long way and have a lot of range anxiety. As I said before, people who live in multi-unit housing, and maybe, have to fight for a parking space with somebody else for their EV charger. Once we get to that level where those people are looking to adopt, I think that's going to really be the test on whether we have enough public infrastructure, but certainly we have a very long way to go. And I can find numbers later and share them with everyone.
Well, put them in the newsletter. That's where they
Yes.
can go. It's a question that you'll want to answer. Okay, Emily asked a question. What about electric capacity within Canada? So obviously, all these chargers, people want EVs, but do we have the capacity to supply enough electricity as fast as the demand grows in certain municipalities? And I think it's a secondary question on that is, you wrote about last year when there was, or earlier this summer when there was the storms in Ottawa and how that resulted in some real challenges. I'm thinking right now of PEI and Nova Scotia and how power's out. So how does this how does the grid manage this EV capacity as well, both regularly with an increased demand and in times of natural crises?
Yeah, so I think to answer the first half of the question of whether there is enough electricity, um, I think the consensus is starting to head towards no, there's not. I know that there have been a couple reports. I think there was a report on Quebec and a couple of the Atlantic provinces looking at that. Um, Kind of the idea that we're running out of electricity. I think RBC has also written about kind of their projections. They also don't seem very confident that we have enough electricity. So there are going to have to be investments in the grid. I think the Globe and Mail reported this week that there is a kind of internal push in Ottawa to put some federal funding towards that and helping the provinces get their electrical infrastructure up to snuff, because it is those are very long-standing, long-term investments that are not built overnight. And there's kind of, I think this idea specifically of emergency preparedness is one of the big fears that automakers and governments are going to have to address if they want to meet this 2035 mandate. I have a friend who I grew up with whose parents own an auto repair shop, and they talk a lot about this stuff on their parents talk about it on Facebook, and they share all these memes that are like, oh, I'm calling the fire department, my house is on fire, but the electric fire truck isn't charged yet. And obviously that's, exaggeration, and that's sort of fear mongering. But I think that those people do have those fears around, if I have to evacuate, I can't just like pour some gas in my tank and go. I need to like charge for 6 hours. That's not going to be possible. What if the grid goes down? How am I going to evacuate? I think those are real fears that people have that are going to have to be addressed if they want to kind of move forward. I think the plus side is a lot of EV makers are putting in bi-directional charging, which is where your EV feeds into the grid, and so you can feed power to your home from your car. And that it can sort of serve as a backup grid. If everybody plugs in their EVs when the power goes out, those EVs can start bringing the power back up. So I think getting that technology out quickly will also help ease a lot of people's fears about the grid too.
We're getting some great questions, and we have about 15 minutes left. So I'll encourage you to keep sending us your questions. As I hope you keep asking them, because I'm happy to ask them on your behalf. And also, Anita, you touched on the 2035 requirements. Just for those that don't know, just to say, Canada's commitment requires 100% of car and passenger truck sales to be zero emissions by 2035. Okay. Ontario specifically, Ontario and Quebec, you've heard a lot from policymakers about the opportunity that presents itself with the EV age. Anita, can you share a little bit of setting the scene of the landscape for us about what makes this part of the world so uniquely suited to essentially build the entire supply chain or manufacturing elements of it for an EV right here at home? What is it that has politicians and executives so excited?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of this backdrop that is quite different for EVs than it is for, I guess, internal combustion engines, in that there has historically been this dominance, specifically in China, over several of different inputs into EVs. Things like rare earth minerals, things like cobalt processing, and all the way up to batteries. CATL is a Chinese battery maker. That's the biggest battery maker in the world. Obviously, Taiwan Semiconductor Company is the biggest maker of advanced chips in the world, and those go into cars as well. So there is kind of this geopolitical tension around the idea that we are, as there have been worries about being dependent on someone for oil, there's these fears about being dependent on someone for EV parts. So that's part of this big push to try to build more things here. Canada makes it no secret that we're one of the only jurisdictions that has all of the minerals needed to make an EV battery. We also have auto assembly here, which other sort of big mining countries like Australia don't do. So we have a lot going for us as sort of an alternative to that Chinese supply chain, but there is a long way to go to get there. And so I think that's going to be that test of that 2035 benchmark of getting all of these mines and refineries and battery processing up and running, and getting people trained to do those jobs, getting the right equipment for those factories. So there's a lot that's happening behind the scenes right now that's going to be a big test for whether we can get those cars on the lot for 2035.
Leads to my next question. What's going on behind the scenes?
Yes. So we've seen, I think, for many of our readers, I think, are following the news, a lot of announcements over the past year or so, I guess 2 years, starting with the union negotiations in 2020, which are coming up again in 2023 around auto assembly and getting EV contracts made in Canada. So that's one thing that's going on behind the scenes. Another thing is the cathode material business, which is the most valuable part of an EV. And we've seen, I think, 3 or 4 different cathode material plant announcements over the past year or so. And then the batteries themselves. So LG and Stellantis are going to build batteries in Windsor, Ontario. And so they will also need other types of supplies like copper foil and anodes and all these other EV things, electrolytes. So hopefully we're going to see some more supply chain build out around that. But I think, the US has passed this new law that kind of favors North American auto assembly and critical minerals from their trade partners for the EV incentives that they're giving out to consumers. So a lot of automakers that maybe do assembly in other places or source their batteries in other places are kind of scrambling now to try and figure out how they are going to be able to fit into this vision that the US has. And so I think the hope is that we'll see more of these battery announcements and auto assembly announcements in Canada to take advantage of that law. So yeah, I think those are some of the kind of machinations that executives and politicians are talking about right now, sort of behind closed doors.
Yeah, there was a huge push. I mean, last fall, if it was last fall, I've lost all sense of time thanks to the pandemic. But when Mary Ng was in Washington, heavily lobbying to try to get that changed, and it ended up working. So there was a question earlier by Stephen Hanratty again about the skilled trade workers needing to be retrained in all of these places. But I'm thinking particularly of a manufacturing line in Windsor, or a Windsor plant. How what is the training? What are the specific challenges to overcome for retraining, and how are both companies and governments preparing for that?
So I think that the auto industry is very interesting to cover because there's sort of this insatiable demand right now for people all the way up to like PhDs in lithium extraction technology, which are sort of very rare to find in North America right now. And then all the way on the other end of the spectrum, people who are in the skilled trades. That is very physical work. That's something that's traditionally been trained with apprentices, and it's not easy to, in a mass scale, say, this is how it feels when this component isn't tight enough, or this is how it sounds when this part of the car isn't running correctly. So training sort of a whole bunch of people at the same time to learn how to make these different types of materials that have never been made in North America before, sort of an end-to-end problem. And I think we've heard a wide variety of different potential solutions for that. I know there are consultancies that are creating VR programs, and also auto assembly companies like Magna that are working on VR programs for training to kind of give that sort of full body effect of this is what it feels like to put this together or work with this robotic machinery. So that's one thing that's going on. I think there are some parts manufacturers associations that are working on like modules that can be done quickly, like sort of 5-minute training videos that you can do on an iPad or a phone for workers at different parts of the supply chain. But I think there's going to be an even bigger need for a concerted push going forward, because there's definitely from one end to the other, we're hearing everyone say there's sort of not enough talent for all the people they want to hire.
If anybody from Magna is listening to us today, I sure would love to see Anita put on those virtual headsets and do some skills retraining for a story. I think our readers would get a kick out of that, and Anita, I think you will too. Question from Deepak again: how does an end of life, and by end of life he's referring to 10 plus years of service, how does that look like? What does that look like for an EV vehicle and the suspected issues related to performance? Since most of the EVs out in the market are in their early years, and we just don't have enough data.
Yeah, so I think that's another big fear that people have with purchasing an EV is around batteries. I think what we hear from EV technicians overall is that EVs require less maintenance than an engine that has many, many parts in it that are all have to fit together, right? But what happens to that battery at the end? Obviously, we've all seen our cell phone batteries kind of degrade over time, and this kind of idea of obsolescence that is built into the devices. And we don't want to see that with a car, because we may be keeping a phone for 3 or 4 years, and we want to keep our vehicle for 10, 15 years. So that's a great question. I think there are companies that are in the early stages of working on things like battery swapping programs, battery recycling. Some people take, I think, Nissan Leaf batteries and reuse them to like power their homes. So there are lots of kinds of ways that people are thinking about what are we going to do to keep these on the road longer, to reuse these resources that we're putting into these vehicles. But I think that's absolutely a fair observation that there aren't enough vehicles out there to really know for sure.
Okay, one last question here that kind of brings us all together. At the end of the day, everything is about price. Do you think the cost of EVs or the price of EVs will go down in the near future?
So there's obviously, I guess it depends on what you mean by near future. There's been a huge decline in the cost of what it takes to make a battery in the past 10 years. And that's one of the reasons that we're hitting this point where we can see mass scale production. Part of that depends on the chemistry of the battery itself. There are some types of batteries that use iron and phosphate, which are very abundant. There are some that use nickel and cobalt, and cobalt is not as abundant. And so trying to figure out, okay, we need to make way, way more of these batteries than we ever have before. I think that's going to be a big limiting factor of how many EVs we're going to be able to make, and how rare they're going to be, and how costly they're going to be if we can keep those costs as low as they are right now by having enough sort of mined materials to put in them. So, I think scientists are working a lot on sort of alternate types of batteries that use less inputs, and so those can kind of help supplement the market and keep prices low. Hopefully we get more mines online so that there isn't as much control over the price of some products that are concentrated in certain countries right now. But those, I think, are going to be some big limiting factors that we have going forward on price. And mines usually take 15 years sometimes to get online. So this is something that we already should have been working on yesterday. So yeah, I think it's possible that costs will go down, at least in the short term, next 5 years or so. I think once we hit a certain tipping point of adoption where, car makers are being mandated by the government to make all EVs, we may hit kind of a limit where things swing back up unless something changes.
I know I said we were done, but I have one more question. It comes in from Kamal, and I think it's a great question. A lot of the OEMs and the dealers, they make their revenue from parts and services businesses, not necessarily from the sale of a car. And so Kamal's question is, as the share of EVs rises, how do you think the increasing share will impact the parts and services businesses for these OEMs and dealers?
Yeah, so there is kind of this trend, and this goes back to what you asked earlier about Apple and whether car companies are tech companies, because there's kind of this movement, I think, within the vehicle making industry to make everything computerized and everything based on data, and having the automaker themselves have the sort of passwords and codes to access all of those computerized systems, which makes it very, very difficult for parts and services businesses that are, first of all, working on vehicles like EVs that have fewer parts, but also having to get new sort of software skills and licenses and things for every vehicle that they have to work on. And so there may be some sort of consolidation that happens where, it's more profitable to buy all of these, software licenses and make all of these deals with the OEMs at a larger scale than as a mom and pop shop. And so that's, I think, going to be a big structural change in the economy that we, as I guess consumers and governments, have to decide if we're okay with, or if we want to see consumers and mechanics have more access to the data that's in their own cars and the systems that run their own cars, which obviously, can have its own challenges. But I do think that there is a real tension going on in that industry right now that we don't really know exactly what's going to happen, but it's not going to be easy.
You tweet. There's also some companies are experimenting with subscription as a service detail. So it's I'll get my monthly recurring revenue, or have the consumer buy a SaaS model as opposed to going in once or twice a year for a service. Is that maybe you should shed a little bit more light on how that's coming along?
Yeah, so I think in Canada, BlackBerry has been really working on this, but individual automakers have also said that they plan to do this, which is use all the sensors and data that's in your car, that's communicating with 5G, that's communicating with sensors and traffic lights, and use that data to sell subscriptions to upgraded features in your vehicle, sell that data to insurance companies, personalize your vehicle for different driving types so that they can kind of adjust the charging for the type of driver you are and the type of charging you're doing and when you're doing it. So those are kinds of, I guess, that's the vision for what auto companies are trying to accomplish. But the question is, there have been some rollouts that I guess people have not liked around, having to subscribe to get like certain key fob features, or having to subscribe to get heated seats and things like that, we've done for many years without needing any sort of software or app or fee. It was just part of your car. And I think some people are wondering, is this really necessary? Is this sort of just a cash grab? So yeah, I think all of these kinds of this consolidation of so much data and so much power going into the automakers themselves and how they design their software, and how often they update it, it's probably going to be a big differentiating factor for which vehicle you buy in the future. If the software for whatever OEM, Volkswagen or GM or whatever, is more buggy or more expensive than software for whatever other OEM, maybe that impacts your purchasing decision a lot more than it did in the past.
Yeah. Hearing you talk about this stuff, it makes me think a lot about Blockbuster and Netflix, and how that whole disruption model is moving into the automotive sector in a way that maybe would have been unthinkable even 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah,
Anita
and I think
Balakrishnan? Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, for another analogy, I think there's also a cybersecurity implications for that. I think we've seen very sensitive industries like government and medicine and law still using Blackberries and still using fax machines because they don't want their communications to be hackable. And that will also have implications for the safety of important people driving those vehicles in the future, and wanting to protect heads of state from having their vehicles hacked. So that's going to be a whole other dynamic that I think is going to come into play as well.
For sure. And if there's one thing we've learned through this, it's that regulatory takes longer to catch up to shifting consumer trends, and other companies, incumbents, legacy players take longer to transition. So one last one last point here from this Google research that I'll share is I think Claudia shared at the beginning, but more than a quarter of Canadians considered buying an electric vehicle over the last year, and nearly half of them ended up buying one, which was up from a third just a year earlier. So disruption, when it happens fast, folks. Anita Balakrishnan, thank you so much, as always, for your time. I also want to thank Google and Claudia Siama. Thank you to our partner, Google Think Auto, for making this event possible and for your continued support in making Shift free. It is free, folks, but that doesn't mean that the logic is free. The great reporting that Anita does, Anita runs this beat. She owns this beat. One of the things that's great about the logic is that we have reporters who are experts in their beat, as you've witnessed today. And that means that the reporting you can get from them is reliable, trustworthy, fair, and the best in the business. So please, if you're not a subscriber, we'd love to have you. I also want to thank the Logic business team, Amanda Roth, Justine Lee, Max Zibai, Ariel Lepel-Walker, and our technical producer, Matthew Rideout, for all behind-the-scenes work today. We have another upcoming event. Join the Logic's executive editor, April Fong, and reporter David Reevely for a subscriber event. I mentioned a 6-part series we did on supply chains. They're going to do a deep dive in how companies are applying a shift from just-in-time to just-in-case thinking in supply chains. It was a great 6-part series that I hope you will join us again. Thank you again to our partner, Google, and our special guest, Claudia Siama. You can find The Logic on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. That's it for us. Have a terrific day.